They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
The bloody ambush in New Orleans. The rain had just let up, leaving the cobblestone streets of the Vieux Carré slick and glistening in the gaslight, an ominous and perfect setting for the bloody ambush about to unfold on that dark, misty night in New Orleans. David C. Hennessy, the 32-year-old chief of police, and his pal, Detective Bill O'Connor, ducked into Dominic Verget's oyster house near the corner of Rampart and Poydras streets. Hennessy, a strict teetotaler, washed his half-dozen oysters down with a simple glass of milk before the two lawmen headed back out into the dense fog. They shook hands and parted ways, with Hennessy walking alone toward his modest home at 275 Girard Street, an impoverished neighborhood lined with dilapidated cottages and shanties. As the chief approached his porch, a teenage boy materialized out of the drizzle, whistled loudly, and kept walking, a chillingly casual, coordinated signal. Just as Hennessy slipped his key into the front door, the night exploded. A massive fusillade of gunfire erupted like rolling thunder. The chief was hit by a devastating volley, 3 heavy slugs ripped into his abdomen, puncturing his intestines, another pierced the membrane around his heart, his left elbow and right leg were shattered by bullets, while a spray of shotgun pellets riddled his torso and limbs. Bleeding like a sieve and writhing in agony, the tough-as-nails cop drew his own pistol and staggered after the fleeing assassins. He chased them through the gun smoke to Basin Street, firing back blindly until his strength evaporated and he collapsed to the cobblestones, calling out for his friend, Billy, Billy. When O'Connor found him lying in a pool of his own blood, Hennessy groaned, "They gave it to me good, and I gave it back the best I could." O'Connor leaned in close and begged to know who pulled the trigger. The dying chief whispered a single, explosive word, "Dagos." By noon the next day, the chief was dead, and the city was thrown into an absolute frenzy. The public mourned Hennessy as a saintly martyr and a famous crusader against the Sicilian Mafia, but folks, let me tell you, the truth behind the badge was as murky as the Mississippi River. Hennessy was a complex, self-made man who had learned the bloody realities of police work from his own father, a Civil War hero and metropolitan cop who was shot in the back and murdered in a French Quarter saloon by a bitter Confederate sympathizer. Chief Hennessy was no plaster saint. He had once quit the force in near disgrace, owned a piece of a local bordello called the Red Lantern Club, and was actively playing sides in a vicious waterfront labor war between the Matronga and Provenzano Italian crime families. To understand how a city gets this twisted and corrupt, you have to look at how the Irish first arrived in this festering, below-sea-level swamp. Decades earlier, starving refugees fleeing the Great Potato Famine were recruited in Liverpool by slick Louisiana cotton merchants who lied through their teeth, promising the ignorant immigrants that New Orleans was just a quick journey to New York or Boston. Instead, these desperate souls washed ashore in a tropical nightmare crawling with alligators, exotic diseases, and relentless, suffocating humidity. The city desperately needed an elaborate system of canals and levees dug by hand, and the employers viewed the arriving Irish as the perfect, disposable labor force. The economics of the antebellum South were brutally simple. Slaves were expensive property, far too valuable to risk on back-breaking, pick-and-shovel work that carried a staggering mortality rate. But if a penniless Irishman dropped dead in the mud for $1.25 a day, he could be replaced the next morning at absolutely no cost. Thousands of Irishmen plunged into the cypress swamps to dig the new Basin Canal. Between 3,000 and 30,000 diggers died in the muck, inspiring a grim local song that lamented how the colliery was stronger than the 10,000 micks who swung their picks. Those lucky enough to survive the grueling labor were crammed into abandoned slave shacks in the poverty-stricken third municipality, enduring unsanitary nightmares. Disease was rampant. During the sweltering summer of 1853, yellow fever, a mosquito-borne virus that causes jaundice, hemorrhaging, and death, wiped out 12,000 people. 1/3 of the dead were Irish, and the brutal sting of Yellow Jack claimed 7 out of 10 working men. Out of this toxic bitch's brew of slave labor, disease, and squalor, the city's vicious criminal underworld was born. The first documented Irish gang violence exploded in 1834 when 2 localized crews, the Cork Conians and the United Irishmen, Both offshoots of rural terror societies back in the old country, waged a bloody labor war over a sugar refinery canal that left 4 men dead. But by the 1850s, the violence had shifted from the ditches to the highly colorful, vice-soaked Gallatin Street district. Gallatin Street was an absolute den of iniquity, packed shoulder to shoulder with barrel houses where liquor flowed endlessly, bordellos, and cheap boarding houses where unsuspecting sailors were routinely shanghaied. It was a miracle for any stranger to walk from Ursuline Avenue to Barrack Street with his wallet and his skull intact. Ruling this chaotic strip were the Live Oak Boys, a gang formed by Red Bill Wilson, a notoriously dangerous hoodlum who hid a knife in his bushy red beard. They earned their name by carrying elaborately carved oaken cudgels, deadly shillelaghs brought over from the Emerald Isle. The most feared members of the Live Oaks were the notoriously violent O'Brien family. Jimmy O'Brien calmly plunged a knife deep into a fellow gang member's heart simply because the man woke up while Jimmy was picking his pockets. His brother Hugh was killed trying to rob a Mississippi River fisherman, leaving behind his 2 sons, Matt and Hugh Jr. These 2 young thugs despised honest labor and spent their nights raiding Gallatin Street dance halls, storming into joints with their oaken clubs, and robbing the terrified patrons who fled out the back. The Live Oak Boys were right at home at Bill Swan's Fireproof Coffee House, a joint that hosted grand national rat-killing matches where rough crowds wagered heavy money on dogs slaughtering dozens of rats in a massive 12-foot backyard pit. In one match, a dog named Skelper killed 21 rats in under 4 minutes before retreating when a rat bit him on the nose. The O'Brien saga reached its own bloody climax in 1886 when Matt and Hugh Jr. got into a drunken spat at Swan's Saloon. They left the bar seemingly on good terms, but out on the street, Matt abruptly drew a pistol and shot his own brother in the side, later coldly telling the cops he was drunk and wanted blood. This relentless wave of muggings, murders, and unchecked depravity eventually forced a parish sheriff to describe New Orleans to a visiting journalist as a perfect hell on earth. For the traumatized Irish immigrants caught in this brutal cycle of starvation, disease, and street corner violence, the sheriff wasn't speaking metaphorically. This suffocating underworld was their literal, daily reality. The dark history of Irish immigrants in southern Louisiana. Step right into the sweltering, disease-ridden swamps of southern Louisiana, where the American dream for thousands of desperate Irish immigrants was quickly exposed as a deadly, blood-soaked nightmare. If you think the Irish underworld was born exclusively on the paved streets of New York or the frozen alleys of Chicago, you need to look closer at the fetid, below-sea-level muck of antebellum New Orleans. This wasn't a city of opportunity for the starving refugees fleeing the Great Potato Famine. It was a deadly trap, a tropical hellhole crawling with alligators, swamp rats, and relentless, suffocating humidity. The horrifying truth is that the vast majority of these immigrants never even intended to go to Louisiana in the first place. Over in Liverpool, where many had fled to escape the famine, slick Louisiana cotton merchants pulled off one of the most ruthless bait-and-switch con jobs in history. Preying on the immigrants' complete ignorance of American geography, these brokers sold them tickets with the flat-out lie that New Orleans was just a quick, easy jump away from their true destinations of New York or Boston. Instead, these traumatized souls washed ashore in a sprawling, subtropical swamp, utterly unprepared for the exotic diseases and brutal heat that awaited them. But the city of New Orleans had a highly cynical, incredibly lethal reason for luring them there. Because the city was built on a precarious spit of land between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, its very survival depended on an elaborate, back-breaking system of hand-dug canals and levees. The brutal economics of the antebellum South dictated a horrifying reality: slaves were considered expensive property, far too valuable to their owners to risk in the deadly, disease-infested trenches. But a penniless Irishman? He could be paid a meager $1.25 a day, and if he dropped dead in the mud from exhaustion or cholera, he could be replaced the next morning for absolutely nothing, as the famine ships were unloading fresh meat on a daily basis. The local establishment was thrilled, with the Times-Picayune callously celebrating the arrival of these Irishmen, green as shamrocks, as a valuable acquisition for the city's internal improvements. The centerpiece of this massive exploitation was the new Basin Canal, a navigational trench meant to link the lake to the mighty river. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Irish laborers were plunged directly into the cypress swamps to dig. The mortality rate was absolutely staggering, though the exact body count remains a point of grim historical debate, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to a terrifying 30,000 dead Irishmen buried along the banks of the canal. The slaughter was so profound it inspired a dark, lamenting local song, 10,000 mix. They swung their picks to dig the new canal, but the colliery was stronger and twice it killed them all. For the diggers who somehow survived the day's labor, The nightmare continued at home. During the height of this immigrant invasion, these destitute workers were crammed into abandoned slave shacks in the 3rd municipality, an impoverished district designated mostly for German and Irish arrivals. The sanitation was unbelievably primitive, leading to rampant outbreaks of disease. In 1847, the Times-Picayune reported a chilling scene on Dauphine Street where 50 starving, skeletal immigrants were packed into a single small house, with some reduced to literally eating straw they had scraped off the street. Then came the catastrophic summer of 1853, when the city was besieged by a devastating yellow fever epidemic. This mosquito-borne virus tore through the vulnerable immigrant population, causing horrific symptoms like jaundice, massive hemorrhaging, and rapid death. By the end of that sweltering summer, 12,000 people had been wiped out, and a full 1/3 of those corpses were Irish. The virus struck the laborers with unmatched ferocity. 7 out of every 10 working men fell victim to the deadly sting of yellowjack. The survivors of this relentless horror show were left deeply scarred, spiritually broken, and emotionally devastated. Driven to the absolute brink by starvation, disease, and exploitation, these refugees began to acquire the desperate, hyper-alert characteristics of hunted animals. Out of this toxic bitch's brew of slave labor, disease, and squalor, the ferocious criminal underworld of New Orleans was officially born. The desperation rapidly evolved into organized, bloody violence. The first documented eruption of Irish gang warfare in the city took place in 1834, when 2 rival crews, the Corkonians and the United Irishmen, went to war. Both of these gangs were direct offshoots of the rural terror societies back in the old country that had violently resisted British rule. But here in the brutal swamps of Louisiana, their warfare wasn't about politics, it was about sheer survival and labor control. Fomented by a sugar refinery company that deliberately encouraged the gangs to underbid each other for digging contracts, the two factions turned their rage on one another in a bloody riot that left 4 men dead and required the city guard to restore order. By the 1850s, this raw, desperate violence began to shift away from the muddy ditches and labor camps. The Irish gangbangers had learned that there was a much easier, far more lucrative way to survive in this perfect hell on earth. They took their shillelaghs and their street-honed brutality straight into the highly colorful, vice-soaked dens of the Gallatin Street District, fully abandoning the pick and shovel for a life of gambling, extortion, and blood-soaked racketeering, the underworld of New Orleans in the 1850s. Step right off the muddy, blood-soaked streets and into the neon-lit, sin-soaked heart of the New Orleans French Quarter in the 1850s. If you think the criminal underworld of this era was fully organized and controlled by a centralized political machine like New York's Tammany Hall, you are dead wrong. The Vieux Carré was a wild, delicate microcosm packed with an ethnic polyglot of independent, mid to low-level operators all violently carving out their own profitable niches. The city was heavily thronged with soldiers from the Mexican War, adventurers, and desperate fortune hunters en route to the California Gold Rush, providing a massive, transient population of suckers for the city's sharpies and bunco men. In the sprawling realm of high-stakes gambling, one man revolutionized the racket, an Irish Protestant from Kentucky named Price McGrath. Starting out as a humble tailor, McGrath soon abandoned his needles for the life of a steamboat card player and faro dealer, eventually arriving in New Orleans in 1855 with a staggering $70,000 bankroll. He used that fortune to open McGrath and Company, a luxurious palace of chance at 4 Carondelet Street. Forget the grimy barrel houses where thugs like the Live Oak Boys drank. McGrath's establishment was pure elegance, featuring croupiers who wore tailored frock coats in the afternoon and full evening dress after dinner. By masterfully greasing the palms of politicians, police, and state officials, McGrath turned a staggering annual profit of $80,000 to $100,000. His operation set the gold standard for commercialized vice, generating an underworld cash flow that kept the upper world fat and happy, before he eventually teamed up with New York's legendary John Old Smoke Morrissey and later retired to breed thoroughbred horses in Kentucky. But folks, let me tell you, if gambling was the engine of the French Quarter, the world's oldest profession was its very foundation. By 1870, the city boasted a population of 190,000, and there was scarcely a block that didn't contain a brothel, ranging from high-class $10 parlor houses down to filthy 15-cent chippy joints. For young, destitute Irish women arriving fresh off the famine ships, the docks were a terrifying trap. They were greeted by seemingly friendly female wharf rats with names like Bridget Fury, Nellie McGee, and Irish Susie, who lured the ignorant girls toward lodging that inevitably turned out to be a house of ill repute. Yet, in a society where women couldn't vote, drink in a saloon, or even walk unaccompanied without scorn, Working in a brothel ironically provided a twisted kind of independence, offering housing, physical protection, and a steady income all in one. A select few of these women clawed their way to the absolute top of the red light food chain. Take the legendary Fanny Sweet, dubbed by the True Delta newspaper as a modern Lucretia Borgia and one of the most remarkable female desperados ever known. Fanny was actually Mary Robinson, an Irish-American girl born in New York, but she was a hardened grifter who slept with a knife and pistol under her pillow. She fled to California disguised as a man, ran a boarding house for minors, and was accused of fatally poisoning a stagecoach driver who had dared to slap her in public. Fleeing justice through Panama, she returned to the Crescent City to fleece wealthy older men and dive deep into the outlawed practice of voodoo, buying potions from Marie Laveau and getting arrested during a police raid on a voodoo orgy. Even when the press exposed her true Irish roots and criminal rap sheet, the sociopathic madam adamantly refused to admit her heritage, clinging desperately to the blatant fiction that she was a British aristocrat. Then there was the undisputed queen of Basin Street, Kate Townsend. Born Catherine Cunningham in Liverpool to a poor Irish dock worker, she was a teenage barmaid who got knocked up by a handsome Irish sailor. Abandoned with twins, she fled to New Orleans, reinvented herself as Kate Townsend, and aggressively worked her way up from a low-level banyo to owning a massive, opulent three-story brick mansion at 40 Basin Street. A very portly woman known for a voluminous bust that provoked astonishment on the streets, Sister Kate ruled her brothel with an iron fist. She charged exorbitant prices, catered exclusively to the wealthiest clientele, and amassed a staggering personal fortune of $300,000 in cash and real estate. But in the underworld, absolute power rarely buys a peaceful end. On the night of November 3, 1883, Sister Kate's spectacular run came to a gruesome, blood-soaked halt when she was violently stabbed to death in her own home by her live-in lover, Drosville Sykes. Sykes was handed a life sentence, but Kate received a send-off fit for a mafia kingpin. Laid out in her drawing room, her massive body was sheathed in a $600 white silk dress trimmed with expensive lace, resting inside a $400 metallic casket adorned with a silver cross. As a Dixieland band played Nearer My God to Thee and champagne flowed freely, the slain madam was escorted to Metairie Cemetery by a procession of 20 carriages accompanied by hundreds of mourning working girls. There was not a single man in sight. It was a macabre, over-the-top tribute to a legendary vice lord, serving as a dark, prophetic precursor to the extravagant mob boss funerals that would dominate the American underworld in the decades to come.